There are very few people in the modern world of rock and metal that are as intriguing as they are interesting to talk about as Nothing Nowhere. And in this video essay, I'm going to be going over the history, the finer details, and some of the background of the artist known as Nothing Nowhere. The 2010s were a time of SoundCloud taking over the entire musical landscape. All of these DIY and lo-fi artists coming up on the scene and amassing massive acclaim and literally being able to build entire careers and large-scale fan bases out of their bedrooms. But it was also a time that alternative rock, and especially emo hip-hop, as well as most lo-fi genres, were starting to sound a little bit homogenous, and a lot of the biggest names that you would hear coming out of the genre started to blend in with each other, or at least would make a ton of different copycats that would try to mimic their appearance and mimic their style and mimic their sound like a bunch of chameleons to try to cash in on whatever they were most influenced by. But one of the artists that stuck out right from the get-go was Nothing Nowhere. While people that write off emo hip-hop as being just hip-hop, there are a lot of artists, and were a lot of artists, that incorporated grunge and emo influences, with a variety of Gen X artists, sounds, and movements inspiring these artists, with their acoustic rock instrumentals and their alternative influences, and especially the moodiness and broodiness of the atmosphere, the tear-stained diary lyricism, the blunt simplicity, the at times screamo type of vocals. And when Nothing Nowhere sprouted up from the underground like some demon, he pretty much started to build a fan base off the back of these extremely emo and alternative rock and screamo influenced songs that were being mixed with the formula of SoundCloud rap and emo hip-hop. And if you go back and listen to some of his first big singles that really blew him up, songs like 20-something, Don't Mind Me, I've Been Doing Well, these are guitar-led songs that, while they are emo hip-hop inspired, they are just as much emo and alternative rock inspired. And it can't be overstated the influence that he had coming out of the Midwest emo scene, as well as the metalcore scene. Because he is from Vermont. You gotta understand, in the late 90s and the 2000s, the New England scene when it came to metalcore and hardcore punk and emo music was, you couldn't even quantify how big of a scene it was. It dominated that area, and even though a lot of people that didn't like hip-hop music wrote Nothing Nowhere off as just a rapper, anyone that listened to more than 5 of his songs, even 2 or 3 of his songs, could see that his formula was a lot different than what you were getting from the contemporary emo hip-hop artists. Because I want you to find me another artist that toured with Thrice and Law Dispute, collaborated with Dashboard Confessional, and literally made metalcore breakdowns on his most recent album and call them just an emo hip-hop artist. He had some different aliases, Never Forever was one of them, but one thing I want to kind of highlight here is even prior to when Nothing Nowhere had his major label debut and started to release albums and transform his style, some of his most famous songs, Deadbeat Valentine, I'm Sorry I'm Trying, Let Down, were released prior to this. And the 2 EPs, Who Are You and Bummer, as well as the Nothing Nowhere LP, were so instrumental in inspiring so many artists that you're just now seeing sort of crop up on the scene because of Joe's influence, that showcased a level of experimentation within emo hip-hop that really brought it into the rock and metal genres. Performing these stripped back songs that would sometimes have a beat, sometimes wouldn't, but were mostly led with guitar and mostly led with screamed or sung vocals in this raspy delivery, all of the emo scene of the Midwest. And before I go any further, the stripped back one-take versions of his songs are some of his most beautiful renditions of his songs and some of just his best songs, and I think a lot of them exceed the originals, singing with a level of gruffness, raspiness, and distortion that was only seen in like post-hardcore and emo music of the 2000s. It was unabashedly from that scene. Nothing Nowhere at the start of his career and throughout a big chunk of his career was faceless. That was part of his branding. He didn't show his face, he didn't really show his identity, and he stayed very anonymous when it came to things like interviews and publications. He was a very anonymous and sort of mysterious artist. And I'm not going to say this didn't help a lot of the buzz, because if you look at bands like Slipknot and Ghost and Sleep Token, having sort of the faceless aesthetic or the different sort of character or identity draws people in because it makes you wonder who exactly you are, especially in the age of modern social media and people wanting to plaster their faces on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and all of these different places. This was exemplified by an older man that is a friend of Joe known as the White Wolf, who is in pretty much all of Nothing Nowhere's older videos and music videos, where he would sort of take the role, and this is kind of just a theory, of the older version of Joe, a Joe that is looking back on his life, that is reflective, oftentimes playing out these scenarios in a storyline type of fashion alongside the music videos. And it wasn't until he started to release later music that he started to show his face a bit more, but it wasn't ever his face. He would usually either have some sort of mask or paint on, as in like the music video for Scully, or he would do this thing where he would cover his face with his hand, so you never really got a solid view of what he looked like. And with this interesting, unique style and sound, and this growing rabid fan base and this anonymity, it wasn't long until Nothing Nowhere was picked up by a major label, that being DCD2. And on October 20th, 2017, we got the release of Nothing Nowhere's very first big label debut, Reaper. And while Nothing Nowhere had toyed with the ideas of the Reaper and death and things of that nature, it wasn't until this record that he really took on the form of the Reaper, calling himself the Reaper, or at least in a metaphorical sense, tackling that sort of topic. And this once again not only put him on the map more, but generated even more acclaim and even more buzz. Once again, Nothing Nowhere was towing the line of these screamed and sung hyper-melodic verses and choruses intersecting with these speedy rap verses and very moody delivery, these tear-stained diary blunt sort of lyrics that were extremely emotional in their aesthetic, but also being very blunt and in your face and not really trying to be too terribly poetic, so it still had that linkage to the simplicity of lyrical writing in emo hip-hop, with the instrumentation of alternative rock and lo-fi music, but also a really good production now that was exceeding all of the lo-fi of emo hip-hop, all with like these really catchy choruses. Now don't get me wrong, you could cut yourself on the edge and angst of songs like Clarity and Kerosene or Scully or Houdini, but when it comes to different styles, you can't find many better singles than something like Hopes Up, where he actually collaborated with Dashboard Confessional. But this was without a doubt a diverging point for Nothing Nowhere sonically. When you look at his past material in comparison with Reaper, the big difference that I personally see is you were seeing a lot less of the emo and alternative influences, as he was leaning a lot more into hip-hop music, as well as the clean production sort of sapping a lot of that rawness of his early material, with many of these tracks pretty much classifying just as rap songs with rock influences. A lot of the screamo and emo-isms pretty much being ripped out, and whether that's because of the label or his own choices, that remains to be seen, but regardless, Reaper still stands as a fantastic album. But stylistically, without a shadow of a doubt, it is extremely different than pretty much anything that you got off of his early material, which was a lot more acoustic and instrumental based. And then in 2018, one of the biggest curveballs of like all time with label signings happened, and Nothing Nowhere got signed to Fueled by Fucking Ramen. Now, God forbid, if this doesn't like tell you that he isn't just like a hip-hop artist, I don't know what will. Because keep in mind, this is the label that back in the day signed like 303, Dashboard Confessional, as well as like Less Than Jake, and has artists like A Day to Remember, Paramore, Fall Out Boy, 21 Pilots. Nothing Nowhere found himself on one of the biggest labels, if not the biggest label, when it came to pop punk and emo music. And I'm going to be completely honest, when you look at him amongst the roster, he looks at first glance very out of place in terms of his genre distinctions, but when you deep dive into his older music and you look at his influences and you listen to his vocals, he kind of fits in that roster like a fucking glove. And then you officially had the album that catapulted Nothing Nowhere into an underground sensation that was signed to a pretty big label after a while, into a very household name in terms of the rap scene, with the record Ruiner, released in 2018. A massive success in terms of views, in terms of publicity, in terms of people talking about it, and the style of the album as well as the song titles drew a lot of people in, with everything ending with ER and taking some sort of like emotional outlook of love and heartbreak. It was very emo hip-hop inspired, but as opposed to Reaper, you started to see sort of those old influences creep in more and more and more more. Songs like Rejector, Ruiner, Sayer, as well as Waster, because while yes, they are very hip-hop in their nature, they show that atmospheric forlornness and loneliness and sort of emotional veneer of early Nothing Nowhere. And the vocals that brought a lot of people into Nothing Nowhere is pretty much what got a lot of people into this record, and suddenly he had a ton of new fans. With this brief 33-minute record, it literally put him on the map as a major name to watch out for. Older fans were very proud of him because that's the interesting thing. You kind of need both the peanut butter and the jelly of Nothing Nowhere. You needed the hip-hop, but you also needed the rock. And going forward, we are going into Nothing Nowhere's rock and metal era. In 2019, there was an EP released, Bloodlust, with Travis Barker. I am a massive fan of this record. I fucking love it. I think it's slept on, and I think more people need to talk about it. It is a very short record, but it has Travis Barker, Blink-182, the drummer, on the drums, and Nothing Nowhere is really flexing those rock vocals and those emo vocals, those post-hardcore isms once again. This record still has beats, this record still has the rapping, but it started to take much more of a rock turn. It was also around this time that coincidentally you started to see Nothing Nowhere do more and more of these one-take things, including in 2020 he released a One Takes Volume 1 album, which was just a compilation of all the things he uploaded on his channel of his one takes, his stripped back versions of his songs, where like I said, it was just an acoustic guitar and him singing. You really started to see what he was wanting to do. And one thing that I forgot to add is, I should say, Nothing Nowhere, anytime he tours, he goes on tour with a band, with a live band, and they go under the name Nothing Nowhere, but he performs with, I believe they are his friends. So when you see him live at concert, he's not just rapping with a beat, he literally has a live band with him. Cut to 2021, COVID has taken over the world, everyone's losing their fucking mind, which I should say, I thank COVID for one thing, and that is the fact that Joe was stuck inside, so he had the chance to do a ton of one takes. That is one thing I can say. Bless the fuck up for small blessings. But we had the next album on Fueled by Ramen, Trauma Factory. And this is where you started to see it really come out. Songs like Lights 4444, Buck, and Exile were rap in their aesthetic, but then you had Pretend, and Barely Bleeding, and Fake Friend. The old school acoustic and emo-isms of his early material sort of faded, except on tracks like Barely Bleeding, instead being replaced by these hard-hitting drums, with the percussion being so heavy and so loud, and the guitars being very lively. The 2000s like post-hardcore guitars coming out on some of these tracks are just amazing to hear. Very pop-punk inspired as well, especially when you hear the progressions and the vocalizations and the way the production complements everything. This is where a lot of people started to comment on how Nothing Nowhere started to sound vintage and bring back feelings of the 2000s alternative rock and post-hardcore and emo sounds. And that isn't anything that you aren't seeing happen recently. Like in the late 2010s going into the 2020s, you're starting to see more and more bands live up to the old stylings of metalcore music and post-hardcore music and emo music and especially pop punk, and Nothing Nowhere abiding by that as someone who was doing that in like the mid-2010s, and being able to put it in front of such a big audience was awesome to see. And then we get to the big one, 2023's Void fucking Eternal. Where did this come from? I don't know. Nothing Nowhere finally just decided to throw in the towel and say, I'm just going to become a fucking metalcore artist. This thing is aggressive, it is loud, it is distorted, it is heavy, it is full to the brim with metalcore breakdowns, hard-hitting guitars, and a ton of features. You got Underoath, you got See Space Cowboy, you have literally Pete Wentz from Fall Out Boy, Silverstein, not to mention a breakdown with fucking Will Ramos of Lorna Shore, which has this massive deathcore breakdown at the end of the song he features on. This track listing really does not have many hip-hop isms left. I mean, I guess you could say on tracks like Venom you have the rap parts with the beat, and that is a homage to sort of his past style, but this track listing is unabashedly metalcore. Fuck post-hardcore, this is like a metalcore and a screamo record. There are breakdowns lining all of this, there are heavy guitars, there are massive, huge choruses, and he is singing his fucking brains off. And that's one thing I do appreciate, because Nothing Nowhere's voice is fantastic. I've always really enjoyed his singing voice with his one takes and his early material, and you could always see when he really pushed himself on some of his older choruses that he had some amazingly distorted and raspy chops. You could tell he really practiced the techniques of singing in that post-hardcore and Midwest emo tradition, and it fucking shows here, with this thing being filled pretty much wall to wall with live instrumentation, hard-hitting guitars, massive percussion, and production that feels like a skyscraper. On this album, it feels like the culmination of every single influence that Nothing Nowhere has been toying with for over a decade now, brought together to incorporate so many different influences that he loves, that he is passionate about, and putting them all into this formula that is uniquely his. And I think when you look at like emo hip-hop people that went into rock and metal, I think he is without a doubt one of the biggest, if not the biggest names. And when you see the humble beginnings and how he started, kind of takes you back and makes you sit back like, damn, you can really put your mind to anything and end up achieving your dreams. I personally think Nothing Nowhere is one of the most amazing artists when it comes to the emo hip-hop sphere, because looking at his trajectory, looking at his history and his stylistic changes, the way he incorporated his influences and how he progressed throughout his entire career, I think is not only insanely impressive, but awesome to see how an artist can slowly evolve and progress their style naturally and fluidly, and not only still maintain their fan base, but grow a new one in the process, all while bearing the torch for old scenes that brought them up. I think it's a beautiful thing, all while putting your own stylistic twists and turns and nuances into your style. But what are your opinions of Nothing Nowhere? Old, middle, or new? Let me know down in the comment section below. I can't wait to hear it and discuss it with you. Come join the conversation. Like this video if you enjoyed it. Share it with your friends if you would like. I'd appreciate it a lot. Helps out a ton. Subscribe to join the review family today, and smash that notification bell to be notified of my future uploads. You know who it is. My name is Jay Morris, and I'm signing off saying farewell.